I'm going to be starting today discussing sort of the details about the two calls in Cluster 6 that are targeting collaboration with China. And let me just talk a little bit first about Cluster 6 and how it works. Cluster 6 is the cluster within the Pillar 2 of Horizon Europe that has to do with food, bioeconomy, natural resources, agriculture, and environment. And like I said this earlier before the event, there are more than 100 calls. There's between 1 and 200 calls in each of the clusters. So these are not the only calls that are within there, but these are the two calls that we're going to discuss now. These are the two calls in that cluster that has to do with China, and we're targeting Chinese participation. There's going to be definitely Chinese institutions within these calls that are going to get money from the Chinese government to participate in that. So that's why we're focusing on that. But of course, if you are working in this field of research, you could look at the other calls, and it's open for participation of third countries. So you could like participate in almost all of them. But the ones that are targeting Chinese participation are these two. The cluster 6 on food, biology, and agriculture has sort of a couple of different points. It's here to sort of try to reduce environmental degradation. And it also has the goal of ensure food and nutrition security. So you can see sort of like the scope of what all of these calls are about. And there are many, many calls within the work program that are related to that. And the first one that I'm going to be discussing right now is a call that is called Horizon CL6 2023, Biodiversity 115. So that is sort of like, this is the sort of the call name that you have to look for online if you want to find it in the database. And its official name is Integrated Forest Management for Multiple Ecosystem Services and Enhanced Biodiversity. So the aim for this is to achieve a better understanding on how integrated forest management concept, for example, close to nature forestry, continuous cover forestry, retention forestry, et cetera, are currently applied in Europe and what their implications are on the environment. So if you are a researcher in forestry, which I know there are many of in China, China is very excellent in that field, right? If this is if somebody in your institution is working on that, this could be a really, really interesting call for you. It is already open. It opened in December, but the deadline for this call is 28th of March. So if you want to join a consortium, a group of institutions that will apply for this kind of funding, you sort of need to be already right now looking for partners to work with, because there's not a lot of time. There's only 3 months to finish this. And the indicative budget for this call is 7 million euros on the European side. And yeah, so like that is quite a bit. It's a big call. So basically the context of policy context for this call is it's about forest management strategies that optimize how to actively manage forest ecosystems in such a way that ecological and socioeconomic functions are sustainable and economically viable. So the aim is to achieve a better understanding how integrated forest management concepts are currently applied and to accelerate the implementation of innovative approaches and so on by creating guidelines and tools for this. So I think that a very good starting point is to look at the expected outcomes. When you are applying for these calls, within the call descriptions, they always define some outcomes that they expect there to be after this event, this sort of activity has been finished. And the outcomes in this case includes collaboration and mutual learning and sharing of knowledge among the conservation and forestry bodies, forest management managers, research institutions, and so on. So they want to create sort of a collaborative network. Number two, they want to see practical recommendations and guidelines that address like different objectives of forest management. Then number three, they wanted to contribute to the achievement of the EU forest related policy. For example, like how does it contribute to biodiversity, bioeconomy, climate mitigation, adaptation, and so on. Number four, it's supposed to be trying to achieve diversification of forest management methods in the sense that they want mutual balance and appropriate use in whatever context. And finally, they want to enhance the knowledge on ecological forestry practices and their impact on the climate change adaptation, as well as biodiversity conservation. So if you are working in the field of forestry management, this is basically tailor-made for you, basically. And another part of the call that you should also be looking at is the scope. And basically, they want to see an in-depth analysis on the current concepts and principles in forest conservation and management. They want to see a network of living labs that are sort of inspired by best practices. They want to see some evidence-based guidelines that will be developed. And they also want to see like a lot of different stakeholders involved in this. So we're talking about big stakeholder networks, guidelines, creating a framework around forestry management. And amongst the things that they wanted us to keep in mind is the multi-actor approach, which means that they want like to have a lot of different actors involved in this. So I guess a proposal that does have a lot of different stakeholders is going to be more successful. And the cooperation with China, right? Finally, they also mentioned that the Joint Research Center, which is an EU institution, can also participate in this as a member of the consortium. So that is something you can keep in mind as well. So I'm not an expert on agriculture or forestry, but if you want to sort of see where we are getting our information from, you can look at the recordings from the Horizon Europe Info Days that took place in December, where representatives of DG Agriculture, in this case, Michael Wolf, spoke about the call and also answered some questions. So that's like, you can, when you get the presentation, you can click the recording here, click this link, and you can see. And you need to go to like hour 14 or something like that to actually find it, but I will put the timestamp here. So this is a good way to sort of like, to get a little bit more deeper, get to the source of the material, etc. Then I'm going to point out the second call within the cluster that is also targeting Chinese participation. This is the Horizon Cluster 6 2023 Zero Pollution 2, and this is 2-1 basically. And this is a 2 states call, which means that there's going to be a first states application phase, and then there's going to be a second states application phase later, both this year. So the first phase is probably a little bit more simpler to sort of indicate interest in participating, and which means that there's like no reason not to try to at least get through that first stage. And the deadline for that is now in March, 28th of March. But then you need to hand in a more sophisticated application in September, on the 26th of this September in 2023. And the funding for this is also 7 million euros. And the name for this is quite specific. And clearly, in this case, they have a really good idea and concept of what they want from you. You can read it in the name. There is, the name of it is the optimization of manure use along the management chain to mitigate greenhouse gases emission and minimize nutrient and contaminant dispersion in the environment. So they're basically looking at livestock, cows and other animals, farm animals, and their manure and how that sort of affects greenhouse gases and the climate change, right? And this is in like basically what we're talking about. And if you're a researcher in agricultural sciences, this is probably a topic that you have heard mentioned before. But in this case, we are looking at a huge effort to involve Chinese and European stakeholders from different institutions to create a big research project on this. It is part of the Clean Environment and Zero Pollution destination within Horizon Europe, and it is in line with the Farm to Fork strategy, the methane strategy, and the EU Zero Pollution Action Plan, as well as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So that is sort of like the background from the European Union. And it's supposed to help farm businesses to reduce local and global greenhouse gases and ammonia emissions from livestock farming system. The policy context is the fact that livestock farming significantly contributes to greenhouse gases emissions and also air pollution, at least here in the European Union. So reducing the environmental and climate footprint of livestock farming systems is the goal. And the expected outcomes is to improve cost-effective solutions to reduce greenhouse gases emissions and atmospheric air, water, and environment pollutants. To boost uptake of improved and innovative practices and technologies when it comes to manure management. And number 3, to improve capacity to better manage manure nutrients, minimizing their losses, increasing circularity, and matching demand and supply. And finally, policy recommendation, how to improve manure management, And when it comes to sort of related impact, they're also looking at sustainable, productive, climate neutral, and resilient livestock farming system in general. This is really, really important. Part of the fight against climate change is sort of this whole farming angle. So if you are a researcher or scientist here in China that is part of that effort globally, this is an excellent opportunity to join a really, really strong research project on that topic. The scope, if you look at that, you can see that they want to identify and establish an inventory of up-to-date manure management practices. So kind of like, what are the best management practices when it comes to this? What are the best technologies and what data, etc. Then they want to improve the life cycle assessment method. So like how to assess these models and equipment. Then they want to improve the knowledge of the fate and persistence in the environment of manure chemicals and biological contaminants. And then finally, they want you to demonstrate and test the most efficient strategies and technologies to mitigate greenhouse gases emissions and air pollutants from manure on both regional and local scale. So this is something that is also emphasizing multi-actor approach. They basically want to create like a big research project that includes a lot of different stakeholders, including other EU-funded projects. There are other projects already working on similar things. You might as well be aware of them, including Aeronet, SUSAN, and the ERA gas. You should also take a look at the existing legislation and related knowledge on this. And then finally, this is something that is also connected to China. They are strongly encouraging Chinese cooperation on this topic within the EU-China Food and Agriculture and Biology Flagship Initiative. So this is the second call within the Cluster 6. And if you want to learn more about that, I also encourage you to look at what we were researching, what we studied to communicate this to you, which are the Cluster 6 Info Days talk about that specific call. And when it came to this call, we had from DG Agriculture, Valerio Abadesa, and you can click the link in the presentation when we share it with you to sort of see more. So that is it on these two calls, but either we can go to the Cluster 5, which is Anna's field, or if Voiko is with us, we could look at what he has to say.
Yeah, Haldor, Voiko is with us, and I think he's ready to go ahead. So we can go ahead with him. Welcome, Voiko. I hope now you're able to talk and to be seen, and then now we conclude later with my part on Cluster 5.
Yes, thank you very much, Anna. I managed to solve some problems, so I'm speaking from Gaia's position. So what I wanted to convey to you are more or less the modalities of this participation. So you have first of all to take into consideration that this co-funding mechanism set to allow Chinese participants to be included in Horizon Europe projects. It is something that it is valid for all the countries like China, the so-called non-associated third countries, who we consider not to be directly funded with EU money. And this allows the participation of this kind of participants. So in this context, the two cores of Horizon Europe and of MOST run in parallel. So the specific calls linked to the flagship initiatives on climate change and biodiversity and on food and agriculture are included in these two cores and probably highlighted to strengthen the cooperation between EU and China in science and technology. These are two sectors where we really want to have a cooperation with Chinese partners because we think it is of mutual benefits. These are the two main sectors where we want to indeed to develop this cooperation. So the calls are open. And for the first time ever, the deadlines are even synchronized. So at when the deadline of the most call will expire on the same day, it will be the deadline for the call on climate change and biodiversity, while the one on food and agriculture on European side expires just a couple of weeks earlier. What it is important is that in case that a participant based in China wants to participate, the rules set by most say that these participants have already to be included in a bidding consortium. So at the time you present your proposal to most, you will have to present both the original proposal in English that you have developed together with your European and international partners, and a proposal written in Chinese highlighting tasks and financial resources provided by the Chinese counterpart. Most rules say also that for the flagship initiatives that we have set, there have to be at least three Chinese partners based in mainland China. So these are the general framework of the rules. Then what will happen is that both sides, the EC and most, will perform their evaluation. In parallel, there will be continuous feedback between the two sides in order to produce a common ranking at a certain point will be matched in order to select the best project. Clearly, you might see when you will be more into this process that probably the evaluation criteria used in the two evaluations might differ. That's why it's important that the submission of the Chinese proposals is fine-tuned in order to match the evaluation criterion set by most, which are a little bit different. I'm not going to spend additional details on the rules of the most call. You can find that on most website. Well, basically it is set in a sort of two-stage mechanism where at the submission you just present a short proposal in Chinese, and then if you are admitted to the second phase, you will present a full proposal. Usually what happens is that because of the different timelines, proposals that are admitted to the second stage in the most evaluation are those who have already advanced in the horizon evaluation. So usually it happens that the first stage part is even skipped by most, because most has a rule that in case that the number of participants are not more than 4 times the number of projects to be awarded, then the first phase is skipped. And after the eligibility phase performed by most, which lasts more or less 1 month, that's already enough to have some feedback from the EU evaluation, which runs in parallel, to eliminate those who didn't made it to the next phase, and so most can take the process short, and the first step is skipped. And so essentially, de facto, most evaluation is the second stage only when the full proposal is requested. So summarizing, it is very important to keep an eye on the deadlines. This time, the deadlines are synchronized. So when you finished with conceiving the proposal with EU partners, it's the same deadline for submitting the request of funding to most. So you will have to work in parallel. It is not like in past years. If some of you had experience or this co-funding mechanism already in past years, that you first do your homework with the consortium based in Europe, and then you go to most. You have to do it in parallel because the deadline is synchronized. This is probably more complicated, but the good thing is that the process will end more or less simultaneously. So you won't be in a situation where the project starts in Europe already and you are still waiting in China for most to release funding. That will more or less happen at the same time. So you will be able to start with the EU part of the project at the same time. That's for Chinese participants. For European participants, it's very important that you take these participants on board, especially for those working on climate change and biodiversity, because in this case, the participation of Chinese is mandatory. And without the Chinese participants funded by most, the project doesn't fly. We go directly to the second best ranked. So it is very important that you those who are based in Europe mobilize the Chinese counterpart in order to have this properly set. And as Chinese participants know, most rules say that the core group of Chinese partners have to be made at least of 3 participants. That's because most significantly increased the budget for this cooperation with Europe. And most still has a rule that budget are limited to single participants. So that's why with the increase of the budget, you need at least 3 participants in order to share properly the higher budget that most has put at disposal for every project in order to fund the Chinese counterparts, the Chinese contribution to this flagship initiatives. So this is more or less what I wanted to convey to you. I will stay on connected in case there are additional questions, in case there are needs for additional clarifications. And otherwise, you can always reach us at the mailbox, functional mailbox of the EU delegation. I've received several questions from you, so I know that you know how to use it. And your access is also at disposal in order to provide you with clarifications and additional details on the process you have to follow in order to be part of this EU-China cooperation in the flagship initiatives on climate change and biodiversity and food and agriculture. So hand over to Araxes.
Thank you so much, Voiko. I think this was extremely useful for people. It's even interesting to me to hear, for example, in the past, a lot of the times when you are applying for co-funding and being a Chinese participant in Horizon 2020 projects, you would normally have to apply first for the Horizon project. And if you were successful, you would apply in China. In this case, if I heard correctly, this is simultaneous. You apply at both places at the same time. I don't know if Voiko can answer this immediately. You apply in both places and then the evaluation happens concurrently. Well, in that, maybe you can answer that in a bit in the Q&A. If you, Voiko, could stay with us throughout the Q&A, that would also be really, really helpful. We have a lot of questions. But in the meantime, we still have Anna Fakinatis, my colleague at Euraccess China, a session on cluster 5. That is on the 2 calls within cluster 5 targeting Chinese participation. Maybe Anna can take it away. This is on what? Climate change, and what is the cluster 5 about, Anna?
Yes, Haldor, thank you. Yeah, I'm talking about cluster 5, that is about climate, energy, and mobility. So as you just did about cluster 6, I will provide a short overview, a short introduction about the 2 calls that we have within this cluster that target specifically Chinese participation. So cluster 5 is mainly focusing on the twin green and the digital transition. So it's related to the transition and the goal the European Commission committed to become climate neutral by 2050. I want to specify here, and that is going to be reflected also in the calls, that the transition is also taken into account and like considered from the perspective of the socio-economic transition that take place at the same time. So the calls normally also focus on the utility for citizens and to make sure that there is no backwards and setbacks also from more like social sciences and humanities, if we can say it like that point of view. Anyway, so we have a lot of calls. I have found like more than 500 calls in the 23-24 work program that belong to cluster 5. So let's move to the first one. You find on the top of my slide the code Horizon Cluster 5 2023, direction 1, and then this call is number 0201. We will share also the slides, and if you click on that, there's the link that reconducts you to the specific call on the funding and tender portal. So yeah, everything will be available. So this call and also the second call I'm going to talk about, they both belong to Destination 1. So we're talking about climate sciences and responses for the transformation towards climate neutrality. In this case, we are talking about especially data and model development to develop these pathways to carbon neutrality. And the focus of this call especially is in decarbonization, energy efficiency, and as I just mentioned, the socioeconomic implications that the transition will bring along. We are moving, and this is part of the earlier mentioned EU-China Climate Change and Biodiversity Flagship. The acronym is the CCB flagship, and we move in the context of the EU committing to become climate neutral by 2050 and China becoming carbon neutral by 2050. So a couple of information. The call opened on the 13th of December. The deadline is the 18th of April. Both calls we're talking of in cluster 5 are single stage submission. So there's only this deadline of the 18th of April. And in this case, the funding per project is of 2.5 million euros. So moving on to the scope. What is the project about? The idea is that the consortium that will win the call needs to develop a state-of-the-art modeling and in so doing be able to represent both the technologies and also the policies that are available and that can be applied to work towards these pathways for climate neutrality and carbon neutrality respectively. The work needs to be done jointly, of course. So Chinese experts and European experts need to work together. And the idea is to provide information and knowledge on how these targets can be achieved in both the EU and China. Then there is a specific element and study that needs to be done on deep emission reductions. And this includes also the mitigation of CO2 emissions and in general other greenhouse gases emission. So this is also a scope and an element that needs to be included in a project to be successful. Finally, an investigation of the measures that to provide to become more energy efficient and the technologies for decarbonization, and especially how these measures and technologies can play a role in reducing the emissions and finally get to these targets of climate and carbon neutrality. And I'm going to mention it again. It's here on the last couple of rows of the scope. Also, this project needs to assess the socioeconomic implication of the transition. So, you know, always remember that like in the consortium, there needs to be partners able to provide competences also from this point of view. So not like strictly on like climate sciences. And okay, you might keep in mind on this slide, I think our elements have been mentioned probably more than once. But anyway, let's reiterate the message since it's important. The consortium applying needs to have at least 3 legal entities established in China. I could just explain it very well. Chinese entities can only participate as associate partners and must be co-funded by most. And I'm going to skip to the next slide. You see big on the screen the code again to retrieve this call and the funding and turning portals. And the expected outcomes are mainly these 3. The project needs to improve the knowledge and also the mutual learning between Europe and China on how to achieve the carbon neutrality and a renewable transition that is going to work in the direction of both regions succeeding and reaching their targets respectively. It needs to provide an overview of which options are available and are considered promising to achieve these targets, as well as the benefits and the risks, the challenges that are related and associated to these options. And this review needs to provide these benefits and challenges and explain them in the short, medium, and long term, working towards these paths. And finally, the state-of-the-art modeling and a dialogue that needs to be ongoing, and increased among the relevant experts in the 2 regions. And this is my final slide on this first call, and it's again a suggestion on looking on other resources that are available to you. If you missed the info days on Cluster 5, they were held on 15 and 16 of December. You can watch the recording there. There's also the exact minute where the part on this specific call starts. And there was a speaker from DGRTD that went through what more or less the same content that I provided today. But for sure there is more, and there is also the Q&A session at the end where I think actually Gaia Airulo that is with Voico today was answering questions also, for a specific cause started in China. So you might find also extra content of interest for you. And okay, so let's move to the second call of Cluster 5 that is on cooperation on blue carbon. So blue carbon, we are talking about coastal marine ecosystems like mangroves, seagrass, and salt marshes. And we are again in destination 1. You see that my code is Horizon Cluster 5 2023 direction 1, and this is the code 0202. So the project in general, the aim is to investigate if these ecosystems can be included and how to measure, evaluate, and assess the emissions and the mitigation of the emissions coming from these ecosystems, as well as explore if there are similar ecosystems, like for example algae, that can be included and considered in walking towards this path for climate neutrality and carbon neutrality. I think the deadlines the call are the same. The call opened the 13th of December. The deadline for the single stage submission is 18th of April. And in this case, the funding is of 5 million euros per project. The call is part of the CCB flagship initiative, as well as the EU-China Ocean Partnership contribution. moving to the scope, here like are the main 4 elements. So the project is of course about understanding the emissions and the removals of blue carbon, so the greenhouse gases that comes from these marine ecosystems. And the project needs to aim at understanding and classifying which are the main parameters that affects the emissions and sequestrations coming from these ecosystems. It needs to also create and test models that are able to measure, monitor, and verify this both emissions and removals, and finally also create a portfolio and overview of methods that can be used to reduce the emissions and to increase the sequestrations of blue carbon of these marine coastal ecosystems. Then the project needs to select and choose a specific representative sample sites. So specific sites on both European coasts and coasts of the Republic of China then can be taken as representatives and possibly applied to other areas of the region. And okay, the third element of the scope is also considering, I mentioned it earlier before, what other similar ecosystems could be included. So possibly talking about algae cultivations and other human activities that are also like involved in this like coastal ecosystems. So explore other possible like areas of application. And of course, important as well is that of engaging with international bodies and international research institutions. They are working to tackle the same issue. And let me move to the other slide that is about the expected outcomes of this coal and blue carbon. In general, it's about the understanding, so like providing knowledge. How blue carbon contributes to the greenhouse gases emission in the atmosphere, understand it better, and understand how we can reduce the emissions and use this knowledge to tackle the climate neutrality goal. The second expected outcome is to increase the knowledge on how human activities affect blue carbon. So in managing, destroying, and regenerating blue carbon, how we do affect it and the emissions that comes from it. Third element is the development of measuring techniques. So again, like providing knowledge, especially on like what are the techniques to measure the emissions. Calibration, validation, and monitoring techniques. And finally, the project aims and needs to provide among the results in a review of the current and the potential contribution of blue carbon ecosystems to the greenhouse gas emissions and removals in the two regions, Europe and China. And finally, I invite you to refer again to the info days. You see the slide is similar because the info day was the same, and we had the same speaker, Mr. Ransakai from the GRTD, who talks specifically about this call, and you find all the information on my slide. And Halder, I'm concluding here. And I hope, not being an expert, I was able to, provide the experts who might be here in the audience an idea of what are the opportunities for you guys to cooperate with, European and Chinese institutions in these topics.
Yep, thank you so much, Anna. I think this was very comprehensive, and for those researchers that are working on these exact fields, I think this was plenty of details to understand what the European Union is looking for. Thank you very much. I think we could maybe just move directly now to the Q&A session. I want to share my screen. I also want to confirm while I do that if Voiko is still with us in case there's some questions that he might be able to answer. Voiko, are you there?
I think he was trying to be with us, Halder, but apparently he couldn't hear us at some point. And now I see that he disconnected. I think they're having issues somehow staying connected on Zoom. So we don't have it at the moment, but he was willing to answer questions. So he might, be with us in a moment. Let's see. But let's start without him.
Yeah, sure. No, it's fine. We'll just answer the questions that we can. We'll see if he's here. Otherwise, I want to encourage everybody that is still with us now to scan the QR code in the upper left corner here to join our WeChat group on Horizon Europe. Because one of the things that we could do, of course, is that if we're not able to answer some of the questions directly now, we could keep them in mind and then answer them in the group later, let's say tomorrow or the day after or something like that. So or if you have been listening today and it made you think about this whole thing, you could ask us later in the WeChat group and we could also get it that way. Of course, it's also possible to contact the EU delegation directly, like Voiko said in his presentation. You can send them an email or you can talk to us at Euraccess. All our contact information is on the screen right now, so you can find us on WeChat or send us an email at china@euraccess.org. .net, sorry, and that way you can we can ask us. But I mean, here in China, I think a really good way is just to join the WeChat group. Anyway, so I was thinking that could be a really good starting point. Well,
so Halder, Voiko is with us. He finally managed to connect from his own profile. So let's take advantage.
Okay, so let me see here. Maybe just in case that he's going to have issues, I want to start with a question that I know that I cannot answer, but maybe he could be able to. There's a question from Adine Chen, who is asking about that in cluster 5 or 6 projects that are not necessarily only targeting China, the Chinese institutions should be listed as a formal participant for the application in the application form from the EU side. So he said in those cases where China is being targeted in those calls, China should be called like an associated partner. But he's wondering for these cases, should the phrase external partner make sense? Or what do you think, Voiko? How should you designate the partner level of the sort of Chinese participation in these calls?
Yes, that's very pertinent question. I think it is clearly set in the text of the topics, where for these flagship initiatives, Chinese participants will be considered as associated partners, because as from Horizon Europe, we have extend the concept of associated partners, which refers to every participant which is not paid with EU funding. So whenever you are in a case where you participate to a project, but you don't have you are not eligible to EU funding, you are considered as an associated partner because you need to provide your own funds. That's why the correct label for Chinese participation in the flagship initiatives is the one of associated partners at the moment when Chinese participants form the consortium together with Europeans, and the proposal is submitted to the Horizon calls.
How about other calls? If it's a Chinese, because I think he says not targeting China, but within the same cluster, he's applying for something. It sounds to me like that would also be an associated partner because it's not going to be funded by the European Union either.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. As I was saying in my previous intervention, EU doesn't fund Chinese participants in principle. There are just the exception when evaluators can consider that the participants of China is essential for the success of the project. I'll give you an example. Let's say that in the context of the project, there is a unique facility only in China, or a unique environmental measures that you can do only in China. Then without this participation, the project collapses. So you cannot go on without it. And in order to avoid the risk the Chinese participants might not secure fundings, the EU can exceptionally fund Chinese participants, but only after the opinion of the evaluators. So you run the risk that the evaluators say, no, these unique environmental measures can be done also in South America or Equatorial Africa. I don't know, I'm just making it up. And that this unicity will not be considered by the evaluators as an element to exceptionally fund the Chinese participants. So my advice is always to participate as an associated beneficiary, as an associated partner, and then seek for funding through most mechanisms.
Very good, Voiko, thank you. Another question from Yan Jin is if there's any maximum number of Chinese partner per each Horizon proposal. I know that there's some minimum in some of them, but maximum?
No, there's no maximum. There's no maximum. I mean, there are projects with many partners, with tens of partners. So there is the specific rule that I was mentioning before. From most sides to have at least 3 Chinese participants in case of projects related to flagship initiatives, which is what we are advertising today.
Yeah. Yeah. So no max, but of course, you just have to consider yourself what is a balanced sort of proposal. You know, like it needs to, each partner needs to make sense, etc. And so on. But no strict guidelines on that. There's a question from Yali Si, who's asking about a call on climate change and biodiversity that is supposedly still under development, and is asking when will it be released approximately? Is there a timeline? It's my understanding that this is it, right? Or is there anything else being developed?
Well, what you have found in this work program are topics related both to 23 and to 24. Now we are discussing those that are for which you can apply now. So these are the topics of the 23 work program. But the issue at the end at the beginning of December of the work program concerned also the 24 topics. So you can already find there what will be the teams that will be funded in 24. And of course, we all hope that this flagship initiative on climate change and biodiversity will continue beyond 24. So of course, discussions will continue, and probably the same model as for the 23-24 would be followed. So call expert meetings with experts from both EU and China, discussing together on common goals to be achieved in topics of mutual interest in future calls.
Exactly. So we already have idea about 2023, 2024. We know this timeline. What happens in the next phase is something that we'll see at the end of that phase, if there's going to be anything more, which we hope. There's a question from Francesco Segundo, who is asking if there's any action planned to sort of facilitate a meeting for European and Chinese scientists to try to make a team for submission, I guess like a brokerage event, right? Between European and Chinese scientists in particular. I guess he says Chinese and European scientists with common interest to try to make a team for submission. Are you aware of any such event activity being planned?
Let's say there are 2 ways of matchmaking interests. We had a sort of a series of info day events in December, soon after the release of the work program from our side. And on that occasion, also a brokerage platform was set up. And this brokerage platform was not limited just to the info day event that took place in December, but it stays on. I think at least until the end of the month, at least the end of January. You can still register and try to find a matching. Otherwise, you can also find potential partners directly on the funding and tenders portal. There is a particular section which is find a partner, and there you can find people who are institutes who are trying to present themselves, and you can just go there and find the suitable partner you may include in your consortium.
Yeah, so like there was a brokerage event, not necessarily only for China. There's basically, and then there's this tool, but there's no event for China, Europe necessarily to do any event to do that exactly. But we in Euraccess, we try to support our community to partner with each other. So if anybody here is interested, you can maybe contact us and we can share with everybody like list of interested participants. That could be an idea. For example, in the VChat group, you could either, or you can send us like privately. You can say, we're looking into that or whatever, and they'll be very happy to like share them with everybody that does that, the names of the other institutions. That's one way that we could try to help you maybe. There is a question here. Is there any limitation? This is round 2. Is there any limitation on the number of Horizon projects one Chinese institution can participate in?
I think these are rules of most. You have limitations in personal limitations. So one single principal investigator cannot run more than one project. Otherwise, most will immediately disqualify it. Even one single principal investigator cannot submit 2 proposals at the same time, because that will be immediately spotted and both the proposals will be disqualified. These are internal rules of most.
Got it. So it's good to keep in mind for Chinese institutions. I'm sure they could also contact MOST if they want better information about their rules and regulations. Okay. Professor Yeo Lin is asking if there's any ways that we can find about topics interested by the European partners. I mean, like Voiko just pointed out, there are some tools for partnering. If you're looking about what sort of topics in general, one way to look at is always the Cordis database, where you can see successful projects in the past, where you can see what European partners have been working on. I don't know if there's anything more specific that Voiko would like to add.
Well, I would say that European partners are always interested in cooperating with China, especially in these areas, and as you can see from MOST calls, MOST is ready to fund also participations in projects outside the flagship initiatives that we are discussing today, but in contents always linked somehow to the flagship. So this is more or less the boundary, tackling teams of tackling global challenges, teams of mutual interest. These are the basis on which we want to set the cooperation with China at the moment.
So this actually connects really well to the next question from Ninqing Ni, who is asking, this is a policy question, right? He's saying, these are the only 2 clusters at the moment that is targeting Chinese partners. Is there going to be any other clusters, or let's say fields of research that there's going to be any cooperation in now in 2023 and 2024?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Indeed, in the past, we had more than 2 main flagship initiatives, but at the minute we are focusing on those 2. And I think that in the policy remark that was made at the beginning, it was also said why, because we are currently discussing with the Chinese counterpart a way of rebalancing our relations in STI, and at the moment the 2 fields where we want to cooperate are those fields, as I said, targeting global challenges of mutual interests, and in the 23-24 work program, these are the topics explicitly targeting cooperation with China. As it was said several times also in other occasions, Horizon Europe work program is open in many respects. So here and there, Chinese participants can be part also of other projects, but the agreed cooperation with the governmental Chinese counterpart is on climate change, biodiversity, and food, agriculture, and biotechnology. And for the moment, we really hope that we can enlarge the the scope of the cooperation targeting also other areas, but it is not foreseen on the short term. So for the 23-24 year plan, we will have to keep to what it is written in the work program that was published in December 22.
Got it. There's a question from Yuni Shen. He said, before EU and Chinese partners apply at different times, but now the submit proposal at the same time, right? Like you mentioned this in your presentation earlier, that there's a procedure or something about that. Maybe
yes, that's correct. Indeed, if you look at the deadlines of the climate change and biodiversity topics in EU, in Horizon Europe work program and in most calls, both deadlines are the same, 18th of April. So the same day, 18th of April, the two deadlines will happen. Then I don't know what plans most have, but I would presume, because most has 2 calls per year, that even in the autumn call in 23, you will still have opportunities in case you had missed the deadline on most side. But this won't be the best solution, because in having the deadlines synchronized, also the evaluation process is synchronized, and the end of the evaluation process occurs at the same time, so that the projects can start with all the participants with their funding secure. Otherwise, we risk to face situations like we already had in the past, where the project starts, but the Chinese participants have not yet secured fundings, and they can join the project only at a later stage. So we want to avoid that. That's why the deadlines are synchronized.
Yeah, this is a great improvement, I think, in terms of technicality. Like, yeah, that's very good. There's a question from Yeo Lin, who is wondering, following the question before. So China's side can then initiate some topics and then look for interested European partners. That doesn't sound right. What do you think, Voiko?
Yeah, this seems to be something, a sort of workaround. I mean, topics for the cooperation with China are mutually agreed and discussed before they are issued and released. That's why we think that that will meet the interest and the motivation of Chinese participants in being part of this of these projects, because otherwise. All the remaining topics are not explicitly targeting China, so presumably the consortium will be largely composed by European partners, and it is not that European partners will necessarily look for Chinese partners or for Chinese topics unless there is a strong interest. But this is a strong interest comes from individual links of the consortium or of the European participants in that consortium, not in the willingness of setting a cooperation on that basis.
Just to make sure that everything is very clear for everybody, no matter if you're Chinese or European institution, these topics in Pillar 2 are always initiated by the European Commission. There are topics that have already been published. You don't, as an institution, you don't initiate that. That's something you would do maybe in the European Research Council, for example, where you come up with this idea. When it comes to how those topics are decided, that's like on a political level, and that could include the Chinese government, for example, when it's, as Voiko was explaining, and so on. Okay. There are some questions also that I think are less sort of policy oriented, but let's see if we can go through them. I'm going to go to the beginning. So there's one from Wei Hua Meng at the University of Nottingham in Ningbo, China. So she's just checking, to be a co-principal investigator for the Horizon Europe proposal, do we have to apply through the NSFC or can we join independently? So in this case, for these calls here, the Pillar 2 calls, you apply, you basically participate like through your institution without NSFC, right? That's correct, Voiko. This is different, right?
Yes, that's correct, because these specific opportunities that we have prepared in the context of the flagship initiatives are not with NSFC, but they are with MOST. So NSFC have other kind of cooperation, in particular with ERC, the European Research Council, but that's another kind of cooperation which is on basic science to join the ERC projects, and this is not the subject of what we are discussing today.
There's a question from Yogi, who is asking actually about Marie Curie. This is something that I mentioned in our pre-event, so we might as well respond. He's asking, if you were awarded a Marie Curie fellowship many years ago and have worked in Europe for a period of time, can you reapply for it? What's the current funding policy on this? So when it comes to the Marie Curie eligibility sort of requirements, most importantly, what you need to, I think in your case that you need to consider is that since Horizon Europe started, the individual fellowship have changed into postdoctoral fellowship. So they're only now for postdoctoral fellows, which means that you can have a maximum 8 years of experience as a researcher to apply for it. So if you applied for it, if you already had it, the fellowship many years ago, I assume that you're not eligible for it anymore simply because of that. Beyond that, there's also eligibility criteria that have to do with mobility. So it depends on where you in Europe you are these days and where you want to go, as well as the idea is, of course, that you have to be sort of developing your career and your skills, etc. So if you're doing the fellowship again, you need to explain to them why you need this once more, right? Like, what is the purpose of all of that? I don't know if Voiko, who is also very familiar with Marie Curie, if Voiko would like to add something about this.
No, you guess it right. I mean, the Marie Curie individual, because that's what we are speaking, are now postdoc fellowships, and correctly, as you pointed out, there are rules based on mobility. You have to go performing your job in another country, not where you were based in the last years, and yeah, this is what these are the basis. So if you had a fellowship some years ago, probably you are already outside this 8-year rule that is set now for postdocs.
But we could maybe point you towards other Marie Curie actions, Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions, like the staff exchange. If you have a lot of experience, you might be in a good position now to participate in that sort of thing. That's where you are basically creating a network of institutions, could include a Chinese institution, and you're sending researchers back and forth to do a research project together. So we did a webinar on that in September. The recording is somewhere online. You could look into other things that are maybe more suitable for more advanced researchers, and and could be very helpful for you within the Marie Curie scheme. Okay. I'm going to go, there was also some questions basically about how to get more information about all of this. Lu Chang asks if they can get the shared slides after this webinar. And yes, the slides that Anna and I had, and also the slides I did in the pre-event about Horizon Europe, will all go on our website, china.euroaccess.org. And over there, we will put also the recordings that we had from today. And when everything, it will take us a couple of days normally to upload all of these things. But when it's all there, we will send email to everybody to let you know. And we might also even put it into the VChat group. Why not? So you can see it there. So you'll get the shared slide there. Then let's see. Yeah, Chang Liu is asking the same thing. Where can we get these things? The Yuan Shang was asking if we could please share the links of the 2 ways for matching interest. So like, I guess the things that Voiko was just talking about the Progress event and so on. Yeah, we'll find that. We'll find links to these things and also share this with you, so you are aware of these things. Can we ask questions in Chinese? Let me see here. With ERC projects, does all the research need to be focused on European and associated countries? It depends what you mean by this. Robert Walker asks this. With the ERC project, the research needs to be happening within a host institution in Europe, but it can be on any topic. It's very bottom up, so it does not need to be European focused topic, but it needs to be inside a host institution in Europe. And the principal investigator needs to be working within that European host institution at least 50% of the time of the year, if not more, depending on the proposal that he has. And okay, maybe Vanessa, there was one Chinese question. You could maybe translate for me here. I'll be interested to see what they're saying. See this one here. Oh, yeah, she was just doing that. Thank you, Vanessa. So we want to apply, there's a question, we want to apply for the Chinese government-to-government project, but this project is not targeting China. Okay, so we're talking about one of these calls that are not the 4 calls that we're talking about today. There's a different deadline for submitting the application to the Chinese site. Meanwhile, we also need to submit the application for the European site to SysTech, to an email address at SysTech. Maya asked whether Horizon Europe is only time for submitting the European materials or the Chinese Intergovernmental Fund at the end of January.
Yes, I can take this one. The assumption is correct. What we were discussing today were the opportunities in the context of the flagship initiatives for which we have synchronized the deadlines because we need to have a simultaneous process. But in case that you want to apply for an opportunity outside the box of the flagship initiatives, indeed the deadline is 31st of January, which has been even delayed because initially it was earlier. But the good thing is that in April, May, MOST is expected to publish a second call on for proposals similar to that one that was published in November, and that will include a new deadline. And if you are interested in being part of a project outside the flagship initiatives, what we are discussing today, then you can do it even at a later stage. There will be another call. So for projects that are not included in the silos of the flagship initiatives, but projects have always to be somehow connected to the content of the flagship initiatives. Otherwise, MOST will declare them as not eligible. You will have several deadlines, and in this case, you can jump on a Horizon Europe project even at a later stage, because this is not the core of the cooperation that EU has set with China. That's why the most of the attention has been put on the flagships, where we have mutually agreed on topics, synchronize the processes, and we hope that project will start with all the participants at the same time. In other research projects, it can happen that Chinese participants can secure funding at a later stage, and they jump on a project when the project has already started. That's why in this case you don't have synchronized deadlines. And with this current call opened by MOST, the deadline for these parallel projects is 31st of January. Those who are interested will be happy in learning that most probably there will be a second and a third opportunity later on during the year to jump on these other research projects, but still connected in content with the flagship initiatives on climate change and biodiversity and food, agriculture, and biotechnology.
Okay, thank you very much, Vojko. I think that was very clear. I think this is the end. We will finish our Q&A session on that note. There's a question from Yolin, if we can find the recording on the info session on the EURAXESS website, or should they go to the EU website? Well, yes, this info session that we just did today, we will share this on the EURAXESS website and send you an email. You will find it there, and we will also send you an email. On the EU website, there's also going to be a lot of information. This information will be linked inside this presentation slides that will be put on the EURAXESS website. That being said, I think we can finish today's information session. I think this was very useful. I can see that there was a lot of questions that indicate that there are interested actors in here that are actually seriously working on applying for these calls. So that's really great and always very positive. I want to thank Vojko Pradina from the Science Department of the EU delegation so much for being here with us today. Most of these questions I would not have been able to answer confidently without his help. So that's really great to have somebody here that can. I also want to thank Anna Facchinetti for supporting me with explaining the details of the call, as well as Vanessa for translation for some of the questions that came in Chinese. That was very useful. And then also finally, Nienke Boisman from the International Cooperation Department of DGRTT for starting today's webinar with really interesting insight into the policy context of these China targeted calls. This is really important to understand if you are going to be applying for these. Thank you so much for being with us today, and hopefully you are already in the WeChat group and we can continue the discussion there and the conversation there if you have some questions or want to discuss some of these things. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Halder. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
谢谢大家，再见。
I'm going to end the webinar now.